Yeah, good morning, everyone, from my side as well. I'm also very much looking forward to the two panels coming up today. And after we concluded yesterday with three very exciting presentations focusing on the lives and works of scientists in exile who fled Germany and Austria, respectively in the 1930s, today's panel, the first panel today, is specifically about unbroken careers and the legacy of National Socialist scientists in the post-war period. It focuses on the cases of two scientists, a prehistorian and a theater studies scholar, who made their careers during National Socialism and were able to continue them beyond the war, whether in Argentina or in Germany. As the days before, the discussions will again take place after the two lectures. And now I have the pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Robert Obermair. He studied history and American studies at the University of Salzburg and at the University of Leicester, and completed research stays in the USA, South America, and Germany. He is a collaborator in various research and outreach projects on Austrian contemporary history in a global context, and he's also a university assistant for contemporary history at the Department of History at the University of Salzburg, where he is also writing his dissertation about Oswald Menghin, Politicization of Science in the 1930s and Beyond is the title. And today's lecture is a comparative study of the influence of Catholic national circles in the academic milieu in Austria and Argentina, using the example of the prehistorian Oswald Menghin. So I'm very much looking forward to it, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'll just share my screen here. Okay, can you already see my PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So thanks a lot, Stephanie, for the introduction. So as you said, presenting parts of my PhD project today. And based on the example of prehistorian Oswald Menghin, I'm interested in the influence of Catholic national circles in politics and science in Austria and Argentina. Menghin was well connected, not only in the scientific field, but also in politics. As a professed Catholic, who at the same time was convinced of the necessity of a united Deutschtum, he functioned, so to speak, as a bridge builder between the Greater German and National Socialist and the Catholic camp in Austria. Starting from this specific biography, I will shed light on the political and scientific networks in the Catholic national intellectual milieu of Austria in the 1930s and discuss their influence on Austrian universities in my presentation. In particular, I want to trace how this milieu managed to outlast all the crisis phases of Austrian history in the first half of the 20th century through skillful adaptation to changing political conditions. In the second part of my remarks, I will show that the flight of Oswald Menghin to Argentina in 1947 and 1948 is also no pure turning point, as one might assume at first glance. With the help of Catholic national networks and a quick adjustment to the local political situation, he was able to continue his university career almost seamlessly. Let me just start with a few notes on Oswald Menghin's biography, whom you see here in the picture. Born in 1888 in Merano, he moved to Vienna as a young man, becoming a leading Austrian prehistorian and dominating his field of research in the years between the end of World War I and World War II. Since 1918, so at a really early stage of his life, he was a professor at the University of Vienna. Originally rooted in the Catholic and conservative sphere, he established ever closer ties to the early National Socialists in the late 1920s and 1930s, but more on that later. For now, let's have a look at the group which I've already referred to before, the so-called Catholic nationals. This group of intellectuals has also been described with the German term Brückenbauer, which basically translates to bridge builders and means that they introduced National Socialism to bourgeois circles and made it socially acceptable in Austria. The Catholic national intellectuals put their hope in a consolidation of German power in Central Europe. They always perceived of themselves as being German, in that way creating a new Reich. The most important stopping ground of the Catholic nationals was Vienna. Concrete declarations of intellectuals as Catholic nationals are tricky, as the Catholic nationals were not organized in one single association. Instead, they can be better described as a loose circle of intellectuals whose political bases were associations such as the Deutsche Club. However, they shared a number of values. They were anti-liberal, anti-socialist, and anti-Semitic. Furthermore, Catholic nationals believed in the idea of a German Volkstum. As many other conservative Austrian Catholics, they were in favor of strong authorities within state and church, which turned out, at least in regards to the state category, to be also quite compatible with National Socialism. It is quite important to briefly notice Austria's political development in the 20th century in this regard. As you see here in this graphic illustration, Austria changed her system of government in a quite rapid succession during the 3 decades between the end of World War I and World War II. After a short democratic period, the country was first ruled, as our colleague Linda already mentioned yesterday, by 2 successive Austro-fascist dictators before it became part of the National Socialist German Reich in 1938. In the course of the 1930s, the Catholic nationals hence had to choose what was more important to them, Greater Germany or Catholicism, leading former allies into opposing camps. While most of them initially had been part of the Christian social camp, many became estranged from this camp in the years leading up to the annexation. Oswald Menghin certainly became one of the most politically active Catholic nationals. Catholic academics such as him paved the way for the National Socialists in Austria. As the vast majority of the leading Catholic nationals were established in the Viennese academic milieu, they influenced young Catholic intellectuals and therefore helped spread fascist and National Socialist ideas in academia. At the same time, a number of political clubs and associations became a meeting place for German national and Catholic national Austrians. Members of these organizations helped to propagate all German ideas and ideologically prepare Austria's annexation to Germany. As the Catholic nationals had connections both to the National Socialists as well as the government, they assumed a crucial role in the process of rapprochement between those 2 camps, and in that context also in the preparation of the so-called annexation. During his first years in Vienna, Menghin primarily socialized within Tyrolean and Catholic circles. While he had already taken part in political disputes during his student years, his engagement in the struggle for a German South Tyrol after the end of World War I marked the beginning of a new level of involvement in politics on his part. Now he got together not only with Catholics and conservatives any longer, but gradually established new contacts to the National Socialist camp. These new connections took place on both a political level as well as at the academic milieu. Menghin became part of a number of open and clandestine networks in the 1920s and 30s, which helped him to establish ever closer ties and connections to the power circles in both these worlds I've described so far. Examples for these include, for example, the Deutsche Gemeinschaft and the Deutsche Club, an organization, the latter one our dear colleague Linda has researched in depth. But let me illustrate these developments in interwar Austria on an even more clandestine network, the so-called Bärenhöhle, which maybe might have been more interesting to point out in the context of Bern if we were there in place. But let me skip that side note. So after the end of World War I, Völkisch racist anti-Semitism became ever more socially acceptable at Austrian universities. Catholic and German national elites within the University of Vienna were quite successful in preventing that Jewish, liberal, pacifist, social democratic or communist scientists could establish themselves at the university. Since the 1920s, a clandestine group of 18 professors, calling themselves Bärenhöhle, secretly and rather successfully tried to manipulate personal decisions at the University of Vienna and pursuing an anti-Semitic and anti-left agenda. The initiative was led by Otenio Abel, a paleontologist and fierce anti-Semite, who tried to unite the Christian social and German national professors in their fight against liberal and left-wing colleagues after World War I. The Bärenhöhle was operating from 1922 onwards, trying to prevent, for example, habilitations and offers of chairs to Jewish and left-wing scientists. At the same time, members of the Bärenhöhle tried to push the careers of their fellow members and scientists who were in line with their ideology. While the intrigues of the Bärenhöhle were not completely uncontested, they were quite successful on many levels. Apart from one member, which died in 1934, all known members of the Bärenhöhle, for example, became full or corresponding members of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, so the highest order, if you want it, in Austrian academia. With connections like these, Menghin not only rose to the position of dean at the arts faculty of the University of Vienna during the years of the First Republic, but also became rector of the University of Vienna in 1935, so already during the years of Austro-fascist rule. When Austria became ruled by the National Socialists in 1938, Menghin rose to the position of Austrian Minister of Education. Menghin has thus been described as an opportunist par excellence, and inspired Austrian author Franz Werfel for the character of Professor Schommartz in his novel Eine blassblaue Frauenschrift. It has consequently been argued that the following quote from said novel is probably the most accurate contemporary description of Menghin's political skill, and you see it here on the screen. Like a barometer, one could see in his face, and this obviously refers to Menghin, the variations in the political weather. Whichever side it tilted towards, there would lay the power of tomorrow. End of quote. While it is true that Menghin's worldview and his political endeavors forever oscillated between his Catholic conservative roots and National Socialist ideas, he was not a mere opportunist, as the Werfel quote suggests. Starting with his activities for German South Tyrol after the end of World War I, Menghin gradually underwent the process of political radicalization, which finally led him to his position of Minister for Education in 1938. This was no one-way street, though. Menghin was no mere stooge. He not only contributed to the preparation of the annexation, but he also helped lay foundations for further National Socialist measures. Menghin and like-minded intellectuals, and you see him here in a kind of like graphic depiction of his network at the time, thus consciously paved the way for the rise to power of the National Socialists in Austria, being one of the reasons for the smooth transition in 1938. Having said all that, it has to be noted that Menghin was quite successful in adapting to changing political situations. He was no rampant radical who risked everything in order not to stray from the right path. On the contrary, he carefully selected the opportunities where he was able to act, while at the same time being able to secure his current positions. Otherwise, he would never have been able, for example, to become rector during the time of Austro-fascist rule. In his position as a minister, and we see him here on the first picture of the ministers in March 1938, he was responsible for the so-called cleansing of the Austrian universities, schools, and the cultural sector. Thousands of people were ousted from these institutions because of racial or political reasons. Once the National Socialist rule in Austria had been consolidated, the Austrian government was gradually dismantled, and Menghin returned to his university job at the University of Vienna. In the course of Austria's liberation in 1945, the liberating armies were looking for prominent National Socialists. Menghin was arrested by special US forces in May 1945. He remained in US custody until early 1947, a time during his wife Mara Menghin first tried everything possible to get Oswald released, and later planned for the family's escape to South America. In 1948, the Menghin family in fact managed to flee to Argentina, where Oswald was able to start a second career. Besides the crucial role his family, and especially his wife, took over in this process, Oswald Menghin could draw on a long list of supporters in his attempts to get released from US custody. He could not only count on academic colleagues, both from Austria as well as abroad, but also received backing from the Catholic high clergy in Austria. While he also received some help from his old political networks during the phase of his internment, these contexts should become far more handy in his dealings with the Austrian authorities in the 1950s. But let's go back to the year 1948, when he arrived in Argentina. The situation here in Argentina was ideal for Menghin. Juan Domingo Perón Sosa, whom we see here on the left-hand side, his victory in the presidential elections in February 1946 had laid the final foundation for a massive evacuation, if we want to phrase it like that, of National Socialist and Fascist fugitives from Europe to Argentina. Perón explicitly tried to recruit German, he included Austrians in that category, and Italian migrants. With their help, he hoped to modernize the military sector and to accelerate industrialization in Argentina. Prospective migrants should ideally be of white race, European, Catholic, and well-educated. Already in 1948, Menghin could thus become professor at the University of Buenos Aires, and once more soon was well connected both in scientific as well as political circles. It has been argued that the scientific impact of German-speaking scientists in Argentina after World War II was limited in most cases, as they did not stay there for a sufficient amount of time. However, a number of them crucially influenced the development of the Argentinian science sector. Oswald Menghin's arrival in Argentina has repeatedly been described as a very important waypoint in the development of prehistoric research in Argentina, especially regarding the influence he had on the new generation of Argentinian prehistorians. Immigrants such as Menghin, who easily adapted to these new situations, were able, within a very short period of time, to take over control of the anthropologic and prehistoric sciences in Argentina. During Perón's first and second presidencies in the period between 1946 and 1955, a new university system was sanctioned. The government now kept a tight grip on the universities. Rather than a depoliticization, the government intended to install a repoliticization of the universities by placing the national educational system as a whole as a key propaganda device in the construction and legitimation of the Peronist nations project. The Argentinian Constitution of 1949 accordingly rules that the state entrusted universities to prepare the youth for the cultivation of science at the service of spiritual goals and the aggrandizement of the nation, something Oswald Menghin was well acquainted with from his experiences during Austrofascism and National Socialism. It is thus not surprising that the Austrian ambassador in Buenos Aires pointed out in 1957 that former National Socialists who had fled to Argentina took a liking to Peronism. This was true for Menghin as well, who easily adapted to the idea of prehistory as a political science. Menghin's second career, we see him here with his wife at the beach in South America, in Argentina was astonishingly straightforward in comparison to the careers of other scientists in the country. The first, so to say, test to Menghin's career occurred in September 1955, when a military coup overthrew Perón's government. This military coup was labeled Revolución Libertadora by its proponents and supporters, because they assumed that with it they would save the nation from the Peronist tyranny, which they assimilated to German National Socialism and Italian fascism. The goal of this revolution, hence, was to return to liberal democratic ideals. After Perón was overthrown, the new rulers tried to purge the universities of Peronists. Teachers suspecting of sympathizing with the deposed regime were dismissed, and those who had been expelled between 1945 and 1955 were reinstated. Menghin's further career, in turn, astonishingly, was not jeopardized by his work during the Perón years. He was reconfirmed in his position. As in Europe, Menghin had once more weathered the regime change without any real consequences. He maintained an outstanding role in the anthropological and archaeological sciences in the National University of Buenos Aires and La Plata, which was neither interrupted during the military dictatorships of 1955 to 1958, nor those between 1966 and 1973. In the late 1950s, Menghin, with help of his old political connections in Austria, was even pardoned in his homeland. In the following years, the family repeatedly returned to Austria. Both Oswald and his wife Mara, however, mostly remained in Argentina, where they also died. Taken as a whole, the case of Menghin is a prime example of the multiple interconnections between science and politics. His memberships in organizations such as the Bärenhöhle enabled him to join networks which supported his career. The connections he made in this and other formal and informal networks, however, not only helped him in his academic career, but also offered him political patronage throughout the changing political forms of rulership in Austria in the first half of the 20th century. Keeping all that in mind, these old boy networks were no mere employment agencies, but also transshipment points of far-right ideas. Here, Menghin did not only find influential connections which benefited his career, but also shaped and radicalized his worldview. Even after he had made his escape to South America, he could rely on the help of these old networks in a variety of forms, be it the old connections in Austrian politics, who made his amnesty possible, or his friends in the academic field, who cleared his name in the field of European science. These long-lasting connections, especially to Catholic circles, also facilitated Menghin's escape to South America and the initialization of his second career. Additionally, Menghin was soon able to establish new powerful connections, both the academic as well as political sphere of Argentina, once more proving his talent to stay on top of the developments regarding the reorganization of resource ensembles during the political power shifts of post-war Argentina. He was not only well connected, also in his scientific work, to German-speaking scientists and circles in South America, but also stayed in close contact with his old acquaintances in Europe. These old contacts not only paid off in way of scientific exchange across continents, but also in the repeated and prolonged assistance of old friends, thus playing a crucial part in the process of Menghin's official rehabilitation in Austria. With his two careers in Europe and South America combined, Menghin could develop a long-lasting influence in the field of prehistory and its related sciences. Menghin can hence be seen as a prime example of a politically engaged scientist able to adapt to changing political conditions in order to secure his position in the academic field. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry,
No problem.
yeah.
Thank you very much for this very exciting presentation and the insight. Oh, my camera. And the insights into the two careers of Oswald Menghin and his life, and also into the close connection between science and politics and the influence of the Catholic national circles. Was really very interesting. And yeah, now I would like to introduce the next two speakers, Thekla Neuss and Halvard Schommartz. I start with Thekla. She studied religious and theater studies at the Freie University in Berlin and at the Academy for Theater, Radio, Film and Television in Ljubljana. She will complete her studies with a thesis on audiovisual theater documentation and its conceptualization in the history of theater studies. Currently, she is, among other things, preparing a collaborative project between the Freie Universität Berlin and the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Science on the academization of the arts. Halvard Schommartz studied theater and film studies at the Freie Universität Berlin since November 2020. He is working on his PhD in the DFG project Theaterbauwissen, where he focuses on the history of knowledge, professionalization, and standardization of stage technical knowledge, using the example of Friedrich Kranich's theater technical publications and teaching from about 1920 to 1960. Both have contributed to the exhibition Theater Studies at the Front City University, 1948 to 1968, by the Institute for Theater Studies at the Freie Universität in Berlin. and I look forward to their presentation today, titled Anti-Crisis Objects of Post-War Theatre Studies, Performing Dramaturgies of Epistemic and Personal Continuity through Festschriften in Times of Academic Distortion. So the floor is yours. Many thanks for your very interesting presentation. I think I just opened the floor for questions, and you can raise your hand if you have any questions for the speakers. Isabel Hafter.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And for me, it's like a continuity from my presentation yesterday to yours, because I was focusing on more or less the Second World War, and now you gave us an insight into the post-war era. So thank you very much for this. And my question is whether you know if the circle around Knudsen also was or had a network, a transnational network to the Austrian cycle around Kindermann in Vienna, because there's also this continuity from the Nazi era to the post-war era. Do you know something about this?
To me, what is interesting is the ways of how they did not cooperate, especially the German institutes, but also with the Vienna Institute. To us, it seems that they kept very much to themselves in a way that they were all claiming to be the first institute, and especially Knudsen with his strong desire for being the heir of Max Hermann and really stressing to be the disciple of Max Hermann, did not have much interest actually to cooperate with the other institutes. He rather built up a network, but he very much liked himself as the Berlin intellectual and theater person. He called himself also theater professor, who invited international guests and really created this Kreise of his own. But I think it would be really interesting to know from your research whether there was, or how this interaction actually looked like.
Mm-hmm. Because there are so many similarities. I stop in a few seconds, but there are so many similarities, especially concerning this Festschriften type of publication and the Studententheater types. So yeah, thank you very much.
What you can see is that some of them wrote those Festschriften for each other. That you can see very well. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Any more questions? So I just asked one of my questions to Robert Obermair, and I was wondering whether Menghin was able to use his networks to help others, former colleagues or war criminals, to escape to South America or elsewhere.
Thanks for the interesting question. As far as we know, he did not do so, but he also got together with people who had already managed to flee there. Like, for example, if you remember the one picture I showed you with the ministers in March 1938, another of his colleagues, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Hans Fischbeck, he also made his way to South America, and the two of them got together again. And Hans Fischbeck, who was quite well off, for example, sponsored scientific publications Menghin published. But I have not come across any files where he offered support for people who wanted to flee, but more on the contrary. So he was in the beginning really eager to get in touch with people who provided help. For example, from the Catholic high clergy in Rome, who facilitated his escape via the Austrian Alps to Genoa, where he was able to embark to South America. And he was very eager to get in touch with colleagues in Europe, especially in still fascist Spain. But it was almost every time this pops up in his correspondence, this was in relation to him trying to get help. So it was more this way. He was not really in a position, I think, to offer a lot of help at this point. But it would be very interesting if maybe one day something like that pops up.
Thank you. Any more questions for our two groups speakers? Stephanie Marit.
Yeah, thank you to all three of you. I think in the last presentation, we've seen that there was criticism coming within the field after, a long time. And I wonder, just make the bridge to Robert's lecture. Was there something similar happening in Austria? I mean, there is your work now on Menghin. There is also the book of Johannes Feichtinger, which, on Wissenschaft zwischen den Kulturen, which deals with academia in Austria during the NS. But this Menghin, he fled to Argentina, built his second career, and then you said he was able to go back to Austria and return. I mean, is there some sort of dealing with its own history at Vienna University and also within the academic field, like criticism from within, really, now or in the last 20 years?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good point. So in Austria, we do have like this huge, if you want to put it, caesura in 1988. Or between 1986 and 1988, when we had this huge debate. I don't know if this is like still known outside of Austria, but when we had a presidential candidate, Kurt Waldheim, and in the course of his candidacy, more and more details about his historic past during the Nazi era on the Balkans became public, and this caused like a huge rift in the Austrian population. He eventually became Austrian president, but it led to the fact that like a huge percentage of our population finally demanded that we should look at the past. And this also had an impact that the way this issue was treated by university and scientists for their own disciplines. So there was still a lot of confrontation back then because there were many students of those in question who made their career during Austrofascism and National Socialism. But especially since the 1990s, there has been an increase in critical reflections on the issue in general and also in the specific disciplines. And as to Menghin himself in this context and the disciplines which are kind of mingled a bit, especially in the South American context between prehistory, anthropology, archaeology. This also started in Austria in the 1990s, like the first critical remarks on that past. And there has been some debate ever since. So, but the first really major conference on the issue only took place 2 years ago. So it's still a work in progress. And in Argentina, it's quite interesting to see that his Nazi past didn't affect him in any negative way in the first 2 decades he was there. So it was more actually of maybe, it sounds weird, but of maybe even something positive, like he could, the experiences he could draw upon. So this was definitely anything where he would face any troubles, but there was this short period, which I hinted on with these interfaces between the Peron rule and the military dictatorships, which like were in constant change. And there were short like democratic periods where change was possible. And one of these periods was in 1966. When students at the University of Buenos Aires demanded in the Senate of the university that he should lose his license to teach because of what he had done in Austria. The sad thing is that this debate started, and it was like the university really fought it off, the debate, and a couple of months later there was a new military dictatorship, and while Menghin could continue his career, the student in question who had led the whole initiative, he was one of the desaparecidos, so he was one of those who was, well, who vanished. So he was probably murdered by the new government, not especially because what he had said about Menghin, but he was a critical student in a number of ways. And sorry, I'm already quite long in my answer, but one last comment, because it's not only, I think, an issue of how the own discipline deals with people like Menghin, but also how some of these scholars with a past like Menghin received also public honors. Like, for example, a museum in Argentina was named after Menghin until the early, the early 21st century. And also there, it was only like 15 years ago that a local journalist started a debate, and nowadays the museum has a different name. Whereas Menghin, for example, is still included in the honorary monument for rectors of the University of Vienna. So there are still issues in, I think, both his stomping grounds, if you want to put it like this. And I think the process has not been like completed, although I think at least in the academic sector, the resistance to or the opposition towards people asking these questions about, I don't know the English term, Säulenheilige of the own disciplines, I think has finally faded a bit, but maybe our colleagues also can comment on that issue, because I think it's not something that's specific to Menghin.
Would you like to comment on that last part?
The interesting thing with Hans Knudsen, whom we talked about, is that he's not a Säulenheiliger of the discipline, but that his influence must be characterized differently. And this is something that is really hard to measure, because he has been around for such a long time. He started working at the Institute in Berlin in the 20s. He worked there in the 30s, and he started working again in the 40s and stayed there until 71. He has, as this second Festschrift shows, he has read or betreut, how do you say that? There are so many dissertations that were written under his authority, and until today, when we actually started our research, when looking at the festivities of the 70th anniversary of the Freie Universität, who had conducted like a public participatory format for former students and alumni could send in their good memories with the university. And there was one woman who remembered her great professor, Hans Knudsen. And this is probably an experience she had with this professor, which is valid. He probably was a really good teacher and very well liked by his students, who were not, well, that educated about his history, which he was very good in concealing. And so he has not had a disciplinary impact in the way that he's still read. Nobody reads him, and hardly anybody knows him. But the research question further would be how he was able to get a lot of his people, his students, into the Berlin and West German theater and media scene, actually, and what kind of ideas and thinking about authority and thinking about genealogy of ideas actually distributed into the scene.
Yeah, Mathieu.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for these presentations. And I had one remark and a methodological question for Halvard and Thekla, because I think the Festschrift is a very wonderful object understand the evolution of academic discipline, and as you have said, the intellectual influence, the performance of the continuity, and I think it's a very interesting way to study such evolution of your discipline of theater studies, but it could be also the case of other studies. I had one methodological question, because as you have said, the Festschrift is also like a place of power. It's like a battlefield for the heritage of the master. And you have presented this question with how to say, linguistical or textual perspective, and I wanted to ask you if you have used also a more sociological perspective for the analysis of Festschrift, because I think it's very interesting to see who writes in the Festschrift, but also who doesn't write in the Festschrift. If you have seen some people who are evacuated of the heritage, or even erased of the heritage, or in the contrary, if the people who write in such a Festschrift have a position to pursue the heritage of the master. And it was my question, if we can use this wonderful object of Festschrift in a sociological perspective.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting aspect, because you can see that you have so much information about the people who gather themselves within this Festschriften, which are sociological or with their political histories, heterogeneous, that's really difficult to embrace all the dimensions of what interests are in that Festschrift from each of the contributors. But what can be said, I guess, is that the ones who are in the Festschriften are very specifically chosen. So that's what we touched upon, and it's of course interesting to look at those who are not in it. But yeah, that wasn't the main aspect in our presentation. But yeah, more for maybe you have another comment.
What is interesting to me really is this this objectual status that we have in front of us, because it's this gray literature, which is often analyzed in the history of science as rather subversive to academic traditions, here lies in front of us and really denies access to this really important question of who was writing it and who was invited, who declined or who denied to be part of it, and those are really open questions that I would argue are part of this epidictic performance, in a way, of not laying out who is part of the community and who's excluded. But yes, there's Knudsen was rather clear about whom he liked and who he didn't like. So yeah, to make this clear in a way, also through the Festschriften would be really the next step for this research. Thank you.
Thank you.
So next, Stephanie Marrer, and then Robert Obermair.
Yeah, just a very quick follow-up question, because I saw a name like Karl Zuckermeier in one of the Festschriften, which did seem very strange to me. Just a very quick question: who chose the ones who were allowed or who were invited? Was this Knudsen himself or some very close assistants?
Yeah, it probably came down to the assistants, really. So in that case, where Zuckmayer is writing in the Festschrift, he's writing in, it was published by Dieter Wedel, who was a student at the time, and yeah, that's mainly the circle, students, assistants who compile these contributions or the contributors. And with Karl Zuckmayer, it is an interesting story as well, because he is as one who was in exile and then came back and contributes to a large part of an understanding of theater or post-war theater. He was a really welcomed guest in the Festschriften and was explicitly integrated
into the circle. We have pictures and programs of visits from Karl Zuckmayer to the Institute. So this theater culture of West, especially of West Germany, post-45, is really interesting, a mix of heterogeneous biographies and the ways they mingled. Really, this kind of mingling seems to me really interesting as a practice of like, yeah, political practice in post-45.
Robert.
Thanks. I just wanted to maybe add to them what you discussed a second ago with this question, which I also think is really relevant, who contributes to a Festschrift and who doesn't, because I also dealt a bit with this question in my research regarding Menghin. And I think especially with like these former National Socialists, it's also quite interesting to see who declines to contribute to something like this, who doesn't want to have their name in a publication like this. And if you're like really interested to do more research in that regard, I could recommend to like look in the estates of people who either organized such contributions or who contributed to them, because like in many university archives, you can detect the correspondence of these older scientists, and they often have like keep their records of to which publication they agreed to. And in the case of Menghin, I found a number of letters which were quite eye-opening in this context, where you see the correspondence before such a Festschrift actually takes place, where you find quite open references to others who decline, or to others who participate, or to others whom they don't want to include in the publication because for these and that reasons. So this might be a quite valuable source to check such archival records.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the hint. It's a little bit difficult because it was concentrated so much on the Berlin theater scene. And so they all know each other, and it could well be that such Festschriften also were I don't know, were planned at a premiere, basically. So so it's really much a performed thing in all its dimensions. But yeah, nevertheless, thank you.
So I think we would have time for one last question, if there's any. So maybe I can use my chance to ask a question to Robert. I think you mentioned in your presentation about the role of Menghin's wife. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about her role in the going to exile.
That's a really interesting question. They have a very interesting relationship, I think, for a couple of the first half and maybe also to some part second half of the 20th century. Whenever he was required in any official forms to describe his family, like his kids and his wife, he would put Mara Menghin, housewife. But this doesn't justice to her work at all. She was a very well-known public figure in the 1920s in Austria because she apparently had a quite remarkable voice in reciting poems and literature. so she would constantly appear in public and with performances. And what is even more remarkable, I think, is that she accompanied Menghin already in the 1920s and 30s, but also then later in Argentina and South America on his archaeological field research. So she would go with him in the early 1930s, for example, to Egypt. They had little kids at the time, so they would leave the kids in Vienna, and then the two of them would be for 2 months, 3 months in the desert in somewhere in Egypt. Then she would not only be there like as to accompany him, but she would participate in this work by, for example, cataloging the findings they made and so on. And this was something really unusual at the time. I stumbled across a diary entry from another archaeologist who was really baffled that a woman dared to be like at this man campsite, where I think you can imagine how these archaeologists felt about themselves in the 1930s when they would be in the desert and digging out old pyramids and stuff like that. And it was completely unheard of that one of them would bring his wife along, and that she wouldn't just maybe, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm really like plump here, but it would remain in the kitchen or whatever, but she would really be actively involved in that. And so they had a really, really close relationship. She took over really a leading role in getting her husband released from US custody. So she tried to gather as many academic colleagues as possible, but also like try to get in touch with the high clergy, which worked in Austria, so that they stepped in action. And she really carefully planned the flight of her husband. He first, I didn't have time today to go into detail there with the flight, but he first left alone, but Mara followed him only a few months later to Argentina. And there it was the same. So she would, as I hinted on, she would go with him for weeks on end, somewhere in the mountains to go to indigenous sites they investigated. And so it's quite interesting to see this close connection. But the sad thing is that not only the contemporary description of her, but also like those notes which were published after their deaths. But interestingly, they also died within a couple of months apart from each other. They also always only depict her as a side note to the great Austrian and Argentinian scientists, and I think it doesn't do justice at all to the relationship they had. But he was the one who like made all these academic steps and who had all the publications, but she was always there, I think. So, I'm sorry, this is a lot and definitely not all that should be said on that topic.
But thank you very much. It was really interesting to hear some more about her role, really, yeah. So I think we will, first, thank you very much to the presenters. It was like really interesting presentations and I think a great discussion. So we will meet in about 20 minutes for our last panel. So see you soon.
I will now stop the live streaming for the break.
So, welcome back to our very last session of this conference. Stream is on, thank you. So, we started with Pushpa's presentation on students in the very late 19th and then early 20th century. And now, like in the chronology, we are like furthest away from that point of time, but we're also kind of closing the circle by going back and looking at students and early career scholars, looking at like the younger generation of academics or people in academia again, with the two presentations which will be coming up. So without saying much more, I would like to introduce our first speaker. We do it again the same way. We have the two presentations and then have a panel discussion, which will then lead into a final discussion of the conference. So it is my pleasure to introduce Mathieu Schilabert. He is a senior lecturer in contemporary history at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland and at Unidistance. And he's a specialist in the history of Swiss cultural diplomacy and has focused his research on the trans-bloc cultural relations. He has published a number of books and articles in this area, amongst others, the 2013 publication Dans les coulisses de la diplomatie culturelle helvétique. And I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for your introduction. I will share my screen. Is it okay? Okay. Thank you for the invitation to this conference, which has been awaited and finally perfectly managed by Stephanie and Alexandra, and thank you again. I particularly appreciate this consideration of the complexity of universities and the different analysis levels from the local to the global. In Switzerland, there is no overall view on studies on the history of university. The history of university are very often institutional to highlight the performance and the glorious history of alma mater. There are some exceptions. Two fields are developing and shedding new light on this history. On the one hand, the history of the elites and in particular of the academic staff, and on the other hand, the students, in particular the mobility of students. These two poles come together to highlight the international and transnational dimension of the Swiss university in the contemporary period. For earlier periods, the international connection of the university were clearly established, but for the 20th century, the question arises as to the extent to which universities and international connections have been forces for globalization. For this presentation, I focus on students in the second half of the 20th century. I would like to take up this transnational and mobility dimension and combine it with two themes less often addressed in this history of universities in the broadest sense. The first dimension is the social dimension of student housing. The history of student mobility mainly deals with experiences or support policies, scholarships program, scientific diplomacy. But what happens in the daily life of this mobility, especially in the accommodation where foreign students were staying? Do they reproduce the social origin of the students? Could such places become contact zones in the sense of Marie Pratt, like places of exchange, cooperation, and political confrontation? Or on the contrary, do these accommodations function as places of exclusion where students were isolated? The second dimension is that of the relationship with the colonized students who came to Europe in the 20th century, and even more so after the decolonization of Asia and Africa in the 50s and 60s. This geopolitical phenomenon has a major repercussion on student mobility, especially the arrival of foreign students from outside Europe. The university is a powerful institution for identifying with European culture. Since the Middle Age, the university has been widely regarded as one of the engines of modernity and civilization. In the divide made by colonization between the civilized European and backward primitive, the university played a fundamental role, largely underestimated at present in the history of universities. First, university preserved the civilizational heritage of antiquity, and secondly, universities have developed and disseminated knowledge about the colonies. They have categorized and analyzed the enslaved people, justified an unequal system, and promoted Western competition around technological progress, which became a marker between the industrialized North and the colonial world. In this context, when we talk about the universities of the industrialized North, this means that there were exchanges and collaborations between European countries around this colonial knowledge. Thus, the universities of countries not exercising colonial sovereignty, but participating in the colonization enterprise, played a crucial role. This is what Patricia Purchert has called the colonialism of the margins. It is a colonial involvement from the peripheries of imperial powers. Although not directly involved in the colonial enterprise overseas, Poland and Switzerland participated in the colonial cloud, sharing, uploading and downloading knowledge and representations about colonial world. I borrow this concept of the cloud from Christoph Kamisek and Jonas Krayenbaum. This metaphor of cloud shows that colonization has also colonized European universities. For my presentation, I would like to take the case of two countries that have this seemingly marginal relationship in the colonization process, Switzerland and Poland. These two cases allow to see if, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, this relationship to non-European students has important similarities or rather differences. What is the most important border in the reception and care of non-European students? The ideological border of the Cold War or the North-South barrier? I will divide my presentation into three parts. First, a general description of the reception policies in Switzerland and Poland, comparing flows and chronology. In the second part, I will focus on two host institutions in Fribourg and in Łódź. And finally, I will look at the media coverage of the presence of African students in these two countries. The first thing to be said in comparing these two countries is that Switzerland has a fairly strong tradition of hosting universities, even though its universities, with the exception of the University of Basel, are rather young. At the end of the 19th century, Swiss universities were developing largely thanks to the presence of foreign students. The number of foreign students declined after the First World War, and even more so since the 30s, but it increased again after 1945. At the turn of the 60s, Switzerland ranked 5th in the world with 38% of foreign students in its universities. In the first half of the 20th century, Poland appears to be more a country of academic emigration, and until the end of the Cold War never became a pole of academic attraction like, for example, neighbor country Czechoslovakia. Since the end of the war, the Second World War, there have been foreign students in Poland, as this price except on Chinese student shows. During the Korean War, a contingent of 132 North Korean students arrived in Łódź. However, in the early 60s, there was a more proactive policy in both countries to finance higher education for foreign students from the so-called Third World. One of the first consequences is an increase in the number of foreign students. For the Polish case, it is due to the grants given either by the government or by organizations affiliated to the Communist Party. The latter enabled the establishment of a relation with communist government in the Third World or with opposition movements in Third World countries run by pro-Western governments. The arrival of more foreign students at the end of the 50s in Poland follows a pattern that one could find in other Eastern Bloc countries. With the thaw and the development of a relation between the USSR and the Third World, which was existing on the international arena after the Bandung Conference, the people democracies also engage in cooperation programs. Broadly speaking, these programs were based on sending experts and granting scholarships for students. For these students, an institution was designed for special training and especially for language teaching, and it was the case of Łódź. In Switzerland, the Federal Council developed at the same time a scholarship program as it created a Secretariat for Technical Assistance in the Third World. The aim is to preserve Switzerland's economic interests in the recently decolonized countries and to fight the communist threat. The number of 100 government scholarships does not have much impact on the approximately 6,000 foreign students in Switzerland, but this action leads to other private actions, in particular from the students' community, which is opening up to forms of international solidarity. The majority of Third World students, however, come with their own means. As the graph shows, 10 years after the launch of the cooperation programs in both Switzerland and Poland, Switzerland remains particularly attractive to students from neighboring countries. Poland is rather experiencing a boom with the new arrival of Third World students. For Poland, non-European connection within the global socialism are more visible within the foreign population at university. On the one hand, it can be argued that the Cold War plays an important role. The origin of the student reflects the affiliation to an ideological bloc. Half of the foreign students in Poland come from COMCON countries. On the other hand, this bloc membership has different consequences. For Switzerland, the vast majority of foreign students continue to come mainly from neighboring countries, whereas for Poland, this membership to the socialist bloc make it a country of academic immigration for the first time, especially for the Third World. Half of the foreign students' population came from developing countries. This has an impact on the construction of identity in Poland. The country also presents itself as a pole of attraction and not only of emigration. In both cases, these countries find themselves with a new student population, extra-European and not anymore exclusively from rich elites. Social issues arise, particularly housing. In Switzerland, the reception of foreign students is essentially a private matter. There were a few student houses in Geneva for foreign students at the beginning of the 20th century. But the most important host institution is the Foyer Saint-Justin in Fribourg, which was founded in 1927. This period, therefore, seems to be marked by a desire to increase the capacity to receive foreign scholarship holders, mainly from French-speaking Africa. The issue of student housing is becoming a more visible issue also in the media. Because of their linguistic affinity, the universities in French-speaking part received the majority of the third world students, above all from Africa, particularly the University of Geneva and Fribourg. In Geneva, the first student housing was built and inaugurated in 1963. However, it is Fribourg as a bilingual university that was chosen by the Confederation to host the Center for the Preparation to the University Studies in Switzerland. The failure rate of foreign students at Swiss University was higher than by the Swiss students, and it was decided to organize a preparatory course for Swiss University. First, only for scholarship holders, then for all foreign students at the end of the 60s. The stated aim is to have better prepared students so that they do not occupy places unnecessarily at a time when the number of Swiss students was growing rapidly and putting pressure on the universities. However, this new strategy can also be seen as a policy of assimilation reinforced by a range of activities offered to students. For example, skiing, company visits, etc. Foreign students were a form of investment, and a return on investment was expected when they returned home. In Poland, a similar movement can be observed with the creation of the first foreign student reception and language teaching center in Łódź. So here you have some pictures of the Foyer Saint-Justin, and now the Łódź language teaching center. Some other center followed later, but the Łódź center remained the reference in this field. It is here that new skills in reception were developed and new knowledge, especially in the teaching of Polish as a foreign language. During the Korean War, as I've said, a contingent of North Korean students arrived in Łódź. The choice of the city is not clear. There are two explanations. On the one hand, the city was far enough from Warsaw and to avoid embassies interfering too much in the lives of these students or using them for espionage purposes. On the other hand, this university was built in 1945 and was considered as a socialist model of higher education. I have to remember here that Łódź is an industrial city that has to be also a model for the new social world in Poland. In addition to studies, students could live there. Excuse me, unlike their Polish comrades, foreign students did not have to take entrance exams at university. Since 1951, a preparatory course was also set up in Łódź for them. This was the basic nucleus that would become the center of Łódź in the 60s. The Polish ambassador organized an exam in the locals, and in Łódź were sanctioned by an exam after 2 semesters. In addition to studies, students could live there. Also, advertisements in local newspapers showed that many preferred separate housing. In Łódź, the center building was commonly called Tower of Babel, where promiscuity made housing very difficult. While the buildings were designed for 250 students, there were more than 400 during the 70s. By looking at the course syllabus, one can be surprised at the lack of political or ideological education. Language was central, followed by introduction to the various disciplines. The center developed new pedagogical knowledge of Polish as a foreign language. Global socialism plays a role in the education, but not only education for global socialism. In Poland, the students were therefore as fellows, almost all guests of the government and part of the propaganda panoply. So the relationship with them was linked not only to the racial stereotypes widely shared among the society, but also to the relationship of the people to the communist authorities. The construction of alterity under communist schools would also be influenced by the political context. This combination of cultural stereotypes and the political regime that promoted the presence of the students seemed to be characteristic of the framework in which this cohabitation took place. The center of which is a relevant observation point to see how this confrontation between foreign students and the local population was played out. The concentration of this foreign presence focused the attention of contemporaries, especially the media. Admittedly, the content of the media does not correspond to the general attitude, which is naturally complex and diverse. This gives an idea of new representation about the students and of their evolution. In the 60s, foreign students appeared on the one hand as ambassadors of sister countries, according to Polish official discourse. There was a striking discrepancy between discourse and reality. For example, students from Kenya did not participate in the May Day parade in 1966, and students from Ghana, while the press regularly featured the delegation of foreign students in the procession. The third world students were represented in relation to the loyalty to socialism and their belonging to the Eastern Bloc. Since they appeared in the local press or as part of public festivities as socialist brother and sister, they were considered as coming from backward countries in a typical development perspective. Their presence is thus staged by the communist power as a political and international legitimation. For example, the main building of the 20thCentury, especially its hall, became a hotspot to stage Poland's position in the global socialist world. Representatives of party organizations, diplomats from sister countries, and student organizations met there to make resolutions on international solidarity. These students were used in espionage, both in Poland and abroad. In the archives of the Institute of National Memory, there are numerous files and collaboration with students who had sporadic or regular contact with the unit of the Ministry of the Interior or Security. According to reports on different students who collaborated more or less with the services, the objective was multiple. Monitoring of different groups of students by nationality, observation of embassy activities, use of their mobility abroad, particularly to Germany, to spy on Poles in exile. And for the local chief of the citizens' militia, Bielski, the 20thCentury was a strategical place where a political education should be added to convince students of the legitimacy of the international politics and socialist countries. And he was disappointed that he was not so much political teaching. However, a term that often came up is exoticism. In the former Polish Manchester, however, that was the name of Łódź, the students were exotic or came from exotic countries. Political proximity was also often articulated with cultural distance. And independence of view can be observed in the press only since the 80s. The question of racism was notably evoked, whereas in the Eastern Bloc, this problem was exclusively identified with the United States. In this newspaper, Joanna Sławinska innovated by giving the voice directly to the students themselves. This article considers them also publicly and not secretly, like the security service, as particularly mobile people able to bring information about their feeling during their stay in the West. For example, there is an interview of a student who said, when I was in France and Germany, the students invited me to a party, never in Poland. In Fribourg, in the local press, the presence of foreign students, especially African students, was seen as a contribution to the development of regions that were largely considered backward. Exchanges with the population, however, were sporadic. The meetings on Africa that students organized were little attended. However, within the university and the religious framework, they had space to develop cultural programs themselves, like this, for example, this ball organized in the restaurant in the city of Fribourg. In some cases, they even used the local media to criticize the prevailing racism of which they were victims. In Poland, the racial issue is more quickly discussed since the beginning of the 60s. The discourse shows students as lonely and resourceless, the African students as lonely and resourceless. And this criticism increased, this criticism against this politic of scholarships to third world students increased during the 70s. They led to skepticism about these training policies, which would lead to a brain drain. In my opinion, this media coverage shows above all that this presence questions society. The number of reports and surveys is very large, even though this Black students population represents a small minority. To conclude, this comparison showed that value of the comparison between the two blocks. The traditional history of the Cold War has often stressed the differences. During the Cold War, political and media discourses were very critical of the other bloc's instrumentalization of this cadre training. One can find many articles in the Swiss press that emphasize the racism and difficulties of foreign students in the countries of Eastern Bloc. In Poland, the closed media space leaves little room for alternative visions to that of the regime that staged these third world scholarship orders. A more critical discourse emerged in the 80s. Earlier, however, unpublished sources show some difficulties of this for the students. In particular, films made by Arab or African students at the Polish film schools in Łódź showed the cultural and racial barriers that the students experienced during their stay in Poland. Despite these difficulties, such testimonies showed that the presence of these foreign students contributed to confront the country with new cultural spaces. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mathieu. This was fascinating, and I'm sure there will be many questions for the discussion. But now I would like to introduce our second speaker of this morning, Irina Nastasă-Matei. I hope I didn't butcher your name. She's a junior lecturer at the University of Bucharest in the political science department. She holds a PhD in history from whatever I have this pronounced, Babes-Bolyai University in Cluj. You might correct me after. And she's the author of, I'm going to read that in English, Education, Politics and Propaganda, Romanian Students in Nazi Germany, among others. She has also co-edited volumes on cultural and intellectual history. And I would like to give you the floor for your presentation.
Thank you for this presentation. I will share my screen right now. Are you able to see?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So this is the presentation today is about the academic exchanges between East and West, more precisely.
Just 1 second, we can see your whole screen, not just the presentation.
What should I press? F3?
Oh, this is an Apple. I don't know. I have a Windows.
Okay, I have also an Apple, so I'm not sure, but you can see the.
We can see it. Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Just a moment, maybe to increase it a little bit. Is okay?
Yes.
It's fine. Yeah. Okay. So the problem is that you can see the slides. That's all.
We can see the slides. Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm not sure what to do here. Okay, so this is a switch from my previous researches, as you said, which regarded the academic exchanges during the Nazi regime. But today I'm going to speak about the Cold War. This presentation has to do with the cultural collaboration and knowledge transfer between a communist country, such as Romania was in that time, and a Western democracy like the Federal Republic of Germany. It also presents the point of view of East-West soft power strategies during the Cold War. It also it has to do with today the Cold War studies don't speak about the Iron Curtain so much anymore, but there are new perspectives which show that actually this Iron Curtain was not actually so much made of iron, but it was pretty much permeable or semi-permeable, as Michael David Fox developed this concept of a semi-permeable membrane, or the so-called nylon curtain of Gheorghe Peteri. And also my presentation will try to bring some new insights regarding the status of the intellectuals in a communist state. My presentation has 4 parts. I will speak a little bit about the academic relations between West Germany and the countries of Eastern Bloc, with a focus on Romania also, and then about the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and its politics of supporting fellows from this region. And then, of course, the case studies, which is about the Romanian Humboldt Fellows. And instead of conclusion, I will draw some remarks regarding the relationship of the Romanian Humboldt Fellows with the secret services police, with the secret police in Romania of that time. So regarding the academic relations between the West Germany and the countries of the Eastern Bloc, this was developed in the context of discarding the at the beginning of the Ostpolitics, so that means in the second part of the 1960s. It was started from West Germany, but not from the countries of the Eastern Bloc, and the main actors were the Deutscher Akademischer Austauschdienst and the Humboldt Foundation, and then also the German Research Foundation, the Max Planck Society, and the German Rectors Conference. So the first two, DAAD and the Humboldt Foundation, actually started having a relationship with the countries of the Eastern Bloc already from their beginning, from their reorganization in the early 50s with some of the countries of the Eastern Bloc, but not in a very high numbers, just a very scarce relationship, except for the relationship with Yugoslavia, which was pretty much developed, but that was in the context that Yugoslavia was a neutral country and had also economic and political relationships with the East. These institutions, the actors that I mentioned, they developed in 1970, Eastern European Partnerships Commission, which had the purpose of developing partnerships between the universities of West Germany and the universities of Eastern Europe. So the university partnerships were part of maybe the most constant stance of academic collaboration between West Germany and the countries of the Eastern Bloc, although their development, so to say, was maybe not that coherent and not always very equilibrated between the two parts. So the first such instance of a partnership was developed in May 1970 between the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology and the Technical University of Budapest. But then many other partnerships will follow suit. For example, in Romania, there were 9 partnerships between West German universities and Romanian universities. These university partnerships were financed exclusively by West Germany, and most of the funds were coming from the Foreign Ministry, with also many funds coming from the German Ministry of Education. In all the reports, it is very visible the fact that West Germany acknowledged the fact that this university partnerships is also academic, but it has a lot to do and is part of its foreign affairs. And you can see that stated very clearly in all the Auswärtiges Amts reports. And these quotations that I presented here, they also sustain this affirmation that the political factor was very important in also in developing these partnerships, but also in sustaining and being able to have a dialogue with the Eastern partners. Of course, here the participants agreed that the university partnerships with Eastern European universities and research institutions are of considerable importance given the current political situation. Also, in a discussion in October 1971, the director of the German Research Foundation stated that there is certainly no doubt that the cultural and scientific relations with the countries of Eastern Europe are characterized by special political nuances. This is due to the fact that the scientific institutions in Eastern Europe cannot act as freely as those in our country, but are to a considerable extent dependent on the wishes and instructions of their governments. However, one should not overlook the fact that, of course, a political interest in these questions cannot be denied on our part as well, that cultural and scientific relations are to be classified as a subdivision of the overall field of politics, and that they are of considerable significance alongside economical and political issues. These university partnerships, as most of the academic relations between West Germany and the countries of the Eastern Bloc, soon displayed their limits precisely because of their political nuances and precisely because there were different political systems involved. Especially the lack of autonomy of the universities, the fact that they were completely dependent on the state mattered. Also the fact that the universities, the Eastern Bloc, wanted to choose the specific fields of study, like they didn't really want exchange in every field of study, but mostly technological fields of study, because they were interested in acquiring the technology from the West, which was not very accessible to them before middle of the 60s. This is, for example, I also presented a quotation from the Werner Heisenberg, president of the Humboldt Foundation. This is a statement that he wrote in a report. Yeah, I wrote that to the director of the cultural department of the Foreign Ministry, which he states very clearly that the partnership with Eastern Europe, it's very difficult because of this political differences and because of the lack of autonomy and because of the planning and centralization of the universities administration in these countries. Another academic exchanges between West Germany and the countries of the Eastern Bloc were the youth exchanges and summer trips, which was also developed by the end of the 1960s, they were maybe this was an instance of academic migration and academic exchanges that showed its limits very soon and very obvious. The fact is that it was very difficult for young people from the Eastern Bloc to receive exit permits, and there were various years in which a whole group from a whole country, like for example from Bulgaria or from Romania, could not receive their exit permits and leave the country. These academic exchanges were mostly done by Germans who were coming to visit and come to summer schools, do summer trips in the countries of the Eastern Europe, then the other way around. This kind of academic exchange did not please the German authorities at all, and they consider that they are not actually fulfilling their functions of a really academic and also youth exchanges between these countries. As you can see, inquiries from youth organizations and groups, as well as reports on trips made, show the difficulty of finding concrete partners for a collaboration with the youth in Eastern Europe. The state travel agencies only organize group contacts, which, due to their time limitations and rigorous organization, do not provide any possibility for actual mutual connection. Therefore, the study trips often take on a touristic character, which is only partially satisfactory for the German young people involved and does not fulfill the purpose of the operation, which is the exchange of views between young people with the aim of raising European awareness. This was an official letter which was sent by the Auswärtiges Amt to the West German embassies in Moscow, Bucharest, and Belgrade, and to the West German commercial agencies in Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, and Sofia. These exchanges still continue to take place throughout the 70s and 80s, but scarcer and scarcer, and with the participation of the Eastern youth, always problematic from year to year. One of the reasons was the fact that many young people from Eastern Europe were actually escaping when going to these student trips to West Germany. To give an example, in 1969, 13 out of a group of 28 Romanian young people who visited West Germany at the invitation of the German Society for International Youth Exchange escaped from the hotel where they were staying in the small Bavarian city of Füssen and demanded political asylum. The German media at that time reported that it was already the third group of Romanian youth visiting Füssen, and that there were at least 10 people in each of the first two groups who had also decided to remain in the West. So this made it very problematic for Romanian youth, but also for this kind of correspondence this kind of issues I encountered also regarding other Eastern European countries. And then there was the scholarship system. As I already mentioned, the Ade and Alexander von Humboldt Foundation were already offering fellowships to Yugoslavian students. Also, some of very scarce collaboration existed with Poland and Hungary, but with all the other Eastern European countries, the connection, like the relationship, developed in the second part of the 1960s. There were also scholarships offered by the Goethe Institute for the German language learning, which also developed at the end of the 60s. And the scholarship for journalists offered by the International Association. Of course, there were also very small and very precise fellowship schemes that I'm not discussing here because in each country, there were only 3, 4, 5 people young people who managed to receive such fellowships. But the DAAD and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation fellowships mostly did work throughout this period, although their intensity, so to say, the intensity of the collaboration between these organizations and the countries of the Eastern Bloc depended on political context and the developments in the international arena. So regarding the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, of course, the Humboldt Foundation existed since the 19th century. It was re-established in 1925, and then it was abolished in 1945 because of its implication into the propaganda politics of the Nazi regime. It's already some literature has been already written on this, and it's very obvious. The idea was that the foundation was re-established and reorganized in 1953, and it presented itself as a new foundation, like we would never existed before. Now it's the time when we are establishing for the first time. They were offering this time excellence fellowships for foreign researchers, mostly postdoctoral fellowships. That means that the people who were receiving these fellowships were already important cultural personalities in their in their fields in their country, or were having all the signs that they will become important personalities in their field or studies or in the greater culture in their own countries. What is important also is that they were this Humboldt Foundation fellowships were funded mainly by federal institutions, mostly by also Auswärtiges Amt and the Ministry of Education. Regarding the Humboldt Foundation relationship with the countries of the Eastern Bloc, I already mentioned this, that the relationship became really good in the second part of the 60s. So, in the context of the Ostpolitik, but also in the context of various political developments in these Eastern Bloc countries. For example, in the case of Romania, it's very visible that the first, like the second decade of the foundation, between 64 and 73, it's when the most of the Romanian Humboldt Fellows did receive the fellowship. This is in the context when Ceausescu came to power and there was an opening towards the West at the beginning of his regime. And then it's also very visible that the number of application is dropping, but also the number of people receiving the fellowship is dropping. Of course, the number of application, so A means the number of application and B means how many people actually received the fellowship. And then the percentage is the success rate. And I think the most important is how many people are applying, because it would have been really difficult to apply for a fellowship. You either were recommended and your documents were sent through the local authorities, or you could do the so-called direct applications, which were very, very difficult actually to do because you had to smuggle out the paperwork and send it directly to the foundation. Of course, it was really difficult afterwards to really take up the fellowship if you did a direct application. So the fact that at some point there were many official applications and many applications from a country shows that the relationship between West Germany and that country was good. The information could circulate and the local authorities could get involved in helping selected researchers actually to apply for this fellowship. And you can see that in the case of the countries of Eastern Europe, mostly the second decade is the best. And the political factor is very important and also very visible in the case of Czechoslovakia, for example, when there are so many applications in this second decade and then not so many, actually very few in the next one. But this is explained by the fact that most of the applications were received in 1967, 68, 69, so around the Prague Spring. And actually, this is when most of the Czechoslovak young researchers would receive these fellowships, and then their numbers dropped to 1, 2 a year, not more, but not 60 a year, like, or 80 a year, like it was the case in 68 or in 69. So the political factor was very, very important in this respect. And of course, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation always stated that they are fellowships are offered based on academic excellency, and there are no quotas. But when you are studying their relationship with Eastern Europe during that time and to the statistic and so on, you can see that they tried to favor in various points specific countries, especially the countries from Eastern Europe. Like you can see even in the first decade, like the percentage of receiving a fellowship was 65, the rate was 65% for a Hungarian applicant. That is much more than, for example, than an applicant from France or Great Britain or USA in that same decade, when about 30% would receive the fellowship. That means that not only academic excellency would be important, but also, of course, the fact that the foundation was trying to encourage specific people from specific countries and maybe even specific developments in specific countries. And this relationship with Eastern Europe is very clear. And then, like, for example, the first, here is a hierarchy of the first 12 countries which received the most Humboldt fellowships during this time. And you can see that in the second decade of the foundation, between 64 and 73, there are many countries from Eastern Europe so they were 5 countries from Eastern Europe were in the first 12, which is not the case, like, for example, with the next decade of the foundation. This can also be very easily explained, can be explained through the frustration of the foundation with the poor relationship that actually developed with the countries of the Eastern Bloc, but mostly by the fact that the countries of the Eastern Bloc kind of slided toward a more authoritarian type of communist regime, with the exception of Poland. And this is also visible in the dynamic of offering and receiving and being able to apply and being able to receive Humboldt Foundation from people from those countries. Regarding the relationship with the Humboldt Foundation with the communist Romania, it unfolded mostly, Romania was the first country from the Eastern Bloc to develop diplomatic relations with West Germany. A first embassy in the Eastern Bloc was opened in Bucharest in January of 1967. There was an enthusiasm regarding this taking up of academic relations with Romania in this period, and the foundation did not have any Romanian fellow for a long time. And actually what they did in order to develop this relationship with Romania was to invite former Humboldt fellows to come to take up Humboldt fellowships in West Germany in order to reopen this relationship. This is very funny because the foundation always states that they cut all ties with the old foundation from the Nazi side, from the Nazi time, but actually they in 1966 they invited former fellows from during the Second World War to take up re-invitation fellowships. That was to reinitiate the relationship, which actually happened. So starting with 1966, when there were 2 Romanian Humboldt fellows, then their number will increase very, very much. That was in the first years of the 60s. There were many difficulties regarding the relationship of the foundation with Romania. Encountered many difficulties after the first enthusiasm of the first years. Of course, what the Germans were reproaching to the Romanians were that they only want to collaborate in specific fields, but this was not at all typical only for Romania. This was typical for all Eastern countries, including Russia, for example. The Soviet Union also developed such a relationship with West Germany, but they only wanted to study only technological fields, for example. Another thing was the fact that Romanian authorities wanted to control the granting of the fellowships and also who exactly were these fellows to receive the fellowships. Here, for example, you can see, this is in Romanian, unfortunately, but in order to be able to apply for a Humboldt fellowships and then leave to study in West Germany, you needed to have special permissions from various institutions. For example, here they had, here was a document which shows that the student had an agreement from the State Committee for Culture and Arts, and that in the end of the document, like half of the document, it stated that this person has already got the approval from the party committee of the city where that person was living. He also has the approval of the National Council of Research, of Scientific Research, and then he also has the approval from the Special Commission for Visas and Passports. So you needed a lot of documents in order to be able to leave the countries after receiving the Humboldt fellowship. The fact is that this relationship did not develop well because, again, the control was very strict from the part of the Romanians. This is why some kind of hybrid way of application developed. There were these young people who were recommended by their own academic institutions, but these were not necessarily the best young researchers, but there were young researchers which promised also politically, or which had a specific political profile, or even the ones by the secret services. Many of them were informants of the secret services. On the other hand, there were young academics, which were managing to do direct applications, smuggling out of the country the files. And even if they received the Humboldt, and they are there in the statistic, because once you receive the Humboldt fellowships, you are a Humboldt fellow, even if you don't go to West Germany. Most of the time they were not allowed actually to take up their fellowship. It's very interesting because, for example, to illustrate, the Germans most of the time had the tendency to give the fellowships to the direct applicants, which were not able to come to West Germany, while the Romanian authorities had the tendency of allowing to really go to West Germany to those recommended by the state authorities, which actually were not the ones very successful when applying for a fellowship. For example, in 1972, the Humboldt Foundation received 42 applications from Romania, 25 were submitted through the Romanian Ministry of Education, and 17 applications sent directly. Of the 25 recommended by the states, 5 received a stipend. From the 17 that were independent, 8 received a stipend. That means that the success rate in the case of the direct applications was almost 50%, while the success rate in the case of the ones recommended was only 25%. And that created a very huge tension between the German authorities and the Humboldt Foundation on one side and the Romanian authorities, because you can see constant correspondence in which Herr Pfeiffer, for example, the general secretary of the foundation, even is saying that we are not going to offer you any more fellowships since there are already more than 20 fellows who received the fellowships, but you are not allowing them to come. So why should we open another call for you since you already have so many that you are not allowing them to come? Things became much more strict in two moments. Once in July of 1971, when in the thesis of July marked the tightening of control and a new ideological sour in the direction of the formation of the new man. Culture became even more an instrument of propaganda, and intellectuals were subjected to rigorous political and ideological checks. And also the ideological control over any content that came from West was also tightened. And also in December 1971, a new law was adopted regarding the defense of the state secret, which intensified the surveillance of foreigners and also made it much more difficult for Romanians to go to the West. And then another moment which was which even complicated even more this relationship was the decree number 95 from July 1975, which imposed restrictions and limitations on Romanians' access to study and research in other countries. The decree stipulated that those who receive scholarships abroad longer than 3 months must meet additional criteria. More precisely, the Article 8 stated that the referral to mentioned that the referral to specialize abroad is made at the proposal of the National Council for Science and Technology in collaboration with the ministries and other central institutions concerned. Actually, what they meant for other central institutes concerned from that moment on meant the secret services. From 1975, any young academic wanting to go to the West needed special approval after a very rigorous checkout from the secret services. And then Article 11, which stated that for studying, obtaining a doctorate and specialization, perspective plans for 3-5 years and annual plans are drawn up, which will include the number of scholars, fields of study and specialization, as well as the countries where they will be sent. So that means that the Romanian authorities decided we are not going to send every year, like will allow students or academics to go abroad wherever they want to study. We were going to make plans, like we should make a 5-year plan in which to know which person in which field of study in which country should go. So that actually was completely against the formalities of any foundation which was offering excellency scholarship, because you could not decide 5 years prior who will you allow to study and so on. So that really...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're coming towards the end of your time.
Of course, yes, I'm coming towards the end. I'm just trying to show the statistics of the Romanian Humboldt Fellows throughout this period, and you can very clearly see how they are dropping from 1971 and then from 1975 when this decrees were adopted, yes, and then the relationship stagnates. And then I would like just instead of conclusions to write read something about the relationship of the students with the Securitate. The fact that several hundred researchers and university professors from Romania were able to carry out research internships during the Cold War in the universities and institutes of West Germany is remarkable, both for their subsequent professional developments, as well as for their contributions to the transfer of Western know-how and technology to our country. I'm sorry, no, this is not, actually, I will cut this part because it's much philosophy. And the case of Romanian Humboldt Fellows was no different. If they had not been involved with the secret services before, once they become Humboldtians, they were automatically forced to develop a relationship with the secret services. However, a typology of this relationship between the scholars and the secret services is now difficult to establish due to the incomplete sources available at the College for the Study of the Securitate archives. We know that scholars were required to write at least one report to the Securitate, secret services, or to the Foreign Intelligence Service upon their return. In the case of those who had submitted direct applications, information surveillance files were opened on their behalf. Even without these, they were being monitored because during their stay in West Germany, they had contact with foreigners and Romanians in exile. They could not escape the specific surveillance of the communist regime. Much more sensitive is the topic of the status of informants of the Securitate or of the Foreign Intelligence Service that these fellows had or had to acquire. Here the typology varies. Some were already informants, enjoying the confidence of the Romanian authorities and thus receiving both recommendations for the fellowship and the permission to leave. Others, however, would not be allowed to leave for the West Germany unless they agreed to become informants. This is the case of several fellows who were refused visas for a number of years until they accepted to make these concessions, carrying out their research internship with a delay of several years. Of course, there were also cases where, although they had become informants, the authorities continued to refuse their visa for an indefinite period. These fellows were providing information based on the fact that on promises that were never honored. there is also the reverse. Once they had left and then returned from their studies, some people boldly refused to provide any information outside of a completely benign report in which they only addressed their topic of research and readings abroad, insisting that they had not met anyone and had not engaged in any discussion during their stay in West Germany. They were themselves prosecuted, occasionally investigated, banned from accessing new scholarship abroad. Of course, I'm going to stop here because I still have some points about the Census archives that I can discuss in the discussion. I'm sorry for being a little bit longer than I wanted to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating and really new for me as well. So I'm sure we have plenty to discuss. And I open the floor for questions. I don't know who was first, Marino and then Linda. No, first Linda, I don't know. Okay.
Thank you very much. I have a question to Irina. Because you were running out of time, I would love to hear a little bit more about the Secret Service relation and the reports. What were they reporting? More on political or on scientific aspects? And was there more relationship apart from writing reports? So what was the idea? And the success? What was there in the success having relations like that with the Secret Service or for the Secret Service?
Should I answer now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this is very various and it differs from case to case. So in general, so they were summoned by the Securitate after they received the fellowship, and they were given specific tasks, what to do. And I found very few cases in which they refused, very few cases. Some of them, they were left to leave, even they refused to collaborate with the Securitate, but some of them were never allowed to leave and also not leave for other types of conferences abroad or, but look, the fact with the Securitate archives is that they are not complete. And also the fact that the way we have them today in Romania, it's not the way that we will have them like in 10 or 5 years. The Census archive is constantly receiving new files and new files and new files from the Ministry of Interior or from SRI, for example, from external services of Romania. So you can now say this specific fellow did not collaborate, and then someone or even yourself find to be able to find this file within 5 years, because now that file is not in the archive, but it will be. And this was also my case when I searched for a Humboldt fellow and I didn't receive anything. And I thought, oh my God, he kind of escaped the surveillance of the secret services and he was able to go to West Germany and that. And then I found his file as informant for the Foreign Office, like years later. Like he really wrote reports and like he received specific tasks, go in Freiburg and meet these leaders of the Romanian exile and try to convince them that actually now Romania is open and that they should come and give lectures in Romania so that, you know, Romania should now look like more democratic. For example, I also encountered very few cases in which people went and then when they came back, they wrote these reports and they even went into discussions with the secret, officers of the secret services, in which they didn't actually give too much information. They just said, yeah, now I was all the time in the library. No, I actually never met my professor. I was there once, second time, the third time, he was never there. It's very difficult to really believe this, right? That he never managed to encounter his academic coordinator in West Germany. So this is a very complicated issue. I've never, until now, and I've never given names, for example, only like prototypes. What can one do? For example, there were people who received the Humboldt fellowships and were only allowed to leave after years of a negotiations with the secret services. It depended also who that person was. For example, that person who said, I never met anyone, he was already coming from a family of intellectuals. So he had such a background and a back, so they could not do very much to him, you know? The ones who were like young researchers with no other possibilities of going further in their academic life, but through support from their supervisors in Romania, from the authorities and so on, they had the tendency of collaborating. Now, this collaboration also, does that mean political policing? Some of them did political policing, like going in contact with Romanian exiles and writing about what dangerous attitudes towards communist Romania they have. Some of them just benign reports. You know, also the number of reports, like they were the ones who you can see clearly that they only gave reports when they were asked for, and the ones who really liked to give reports, and they were giving a lot of reports and writing like huge novels about people involved. So this is very difficult, also because of the state of the archives. This is difficult to formalize because of the fact that the archives are not complete, and because the situations are so difficult. But this with the relationship with the Securitate is very important, but I think it's the most difficult, and it will be at the end of my whole research. Yes.
Thank you. So now Marino.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to both Irina and Mathieu for these very interesting presentations. I have learned a lot. I have to take it all in now. I have a question which goes in a similar direction than the one before, but to Mathieu. So, you know, the Swiss authorities were, when it came to foreign students, they were dead set on neutrality, so that they looked that the students would not be politically active and stuff. And I saw that when I looked at students from Algeria, the foreign police of Police de Sûreté, they were always controlling and intercepting their phone calls and their mail, etc. So now with the students, for example, at Foyer Saint-Justin, you have a different situation, because I think the control by the authorities was from beforehand was bigger. They selected the students, I think, with help of the diplomatic outpost or something. But now, and you mentioned those cultural programs, etc. And my question would be, those students in the federal scholarship program in Saint-Justin, where they were living, were they under surveillance from the federal authorities, or were they left alone? So how big was the suspicion still, even though they have been selected beforehand?
Thank you for the question. I've never found in the files of the security service some surveillance on the fellows, the fellow from Swiss Confederation. But I think we have to consider a grant already as a control. If you give a grant, you can control students. This center in Fribourg was controlled with not maybe directly from the police, but from a personnel who was agreed by universities, but also by different ministers, because behind this program of fellows, you have a mix of different ministries. You have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Interior, and different rectors of the universities. So by this program, you have a different way of control, but I don't have seen personal files of fellows in the security archive. But maybe I could only add that it was very a strong policy in Switzerland to avoid policy making, to make politics by foreign students. And you can see, yes, with students from Algeria, students from Angola also, there was very strongly surveyed by the police, and it was the threat by Swiss government was to have political agitation in Switzerland. It was the fear threat was that the Swiss students would be contaminated by foreign propaganda brought through for such students.
Further questions? If not, I have a few. No, first is Pushpa.
Thank you very much, Matthew and Irina, for the talks. Very, very interesting, and also not known about as well. So fascinating from that point of view. My question was to Matthew, and it's really just to ask if there's any information about the students themselves who were experiencing these kind of massive displacements, really, from their original, environments, and that it's very difficult, really, often to find the student experience. So I was just wondering if you'd come across anything that interests you in your research on that front.
Yes, it's the most interesting things in this history, but it's the most difficult things to find out by the experience of students. I'm trying to collect some testimonies by students who have studied in Poland. It's a work in progress. But the best way I found until now to understand this experience is what I've mentioned at the end of my presentation, namely the films that have been made by students at the film school of Łódź. Those films was not published. It was films for studying, and they could choose the topic what they wanted. And these topics are very interesting, and it's not. It seems that it would be not possible to show these films at that period because it was very critical against the regime, but also interesting to see how they have considered, experienced the life within the Polish society. You have, for example, films about a child that was a child of African student with a Polish girl. Then African students go away, and this child remained with its mother in Poland. And it's a short film about this child, and it discusses all the problem for this child that had the skin, black skin within a strong Catholic family. And for example, such film for me is very, very interesting.
It sounds really interesting, that whole area. Thank you very much.
So next would be Rudolf and then Sinja.
Yeah, thank you very much. But the question goes to you. In your research about the Polish system of educating the foreigners, and I think you show a very interesting picture having the Chinese guy there. Did the changes during the Cold War, namely the Sino-Soviet split or any sort of schism, within the communist bloc, did it change the mechanism of that education program at all?
I would say two things. Yeah, it changed a bit because this arrival of a new population of students have brought also new knowledge. And in parallel to the development of this fellow program, you can see the development of, for example, in the University of Warsaw, the African Institute that have made research on Africa, on development policies, and so on. At this institute, it was a lot of foreign students. Mm. So the foreign students have changed also this academic fields. And the other thing I would say is that in Poland, it was very few material and research about how to teach Polish as foreign language. Mm. And all these material have been made in the making with the foreign students. And you can see the development of the methods of Polish learning at this center of Łódź. So this presence of foreign students had developed such a way, and some scholars in Poland have made a doctorate, the PhD about this topic. So there's two things that show that this new arrival of students have changed a little bit the academic landscape in Poland.
Sinja?
I have also a question for Matthew. I think you told us about it, but I'm not remembering correctly. So that one has chosen Fribourg as the place for the student housing. Was it because it was a bilingual university, or were there other reasons for it? Do you know? Or, yeah.
The official reason was the bilingual place for Fribourg. I think it was not so much center where there were already a lot of foreign students, and they could base more easily this preparation course at that place because it was already something. For example, in Geneva, the big house for students have been built after the beginning of this fellow program. So Fribourg was at the beginning of the 60s one of the only place where there were a lot of foreign students.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Are there further questions? If not, I think I use my privilege. I have a number to both of you, but I try to sort of combine them together. But just to stay with this matter of language, I mean, language acquisition must have been a major task. I mean, the students coming from the African, French-speaking Africa obviously had less problems in Fribourg. But when we look at the Polish settings, I was just wondering how that work. I mean, you showed where all these students came from, North Korea, China. So to learn Polish is quite a task. And the same to Irina, all these were postdoctoral students or researchers already, but coming from all different countries of the Eastern Bloc, going to Germany. So was German already a known language? Was it even a thing? I mean, was it a purpose also to learn German to get an academic exchange? with German colleagues. And with that, also, again, a question to both of you. Was there any continuation of intellectual or academic exchange after the stay in Germany or in Switzerland or in Poland? Or was this not possible for political reasons, for exchange of knowledge, which is more difficult than today, or not today, but before the pandemic, when traveling was more possible? So was there a continuation after the program, so to say, was over? Your microphone.
Okay, thank you. So regarding the German, French was at that time the main foreign language spoken by Romanians, and actually France was the main academic partner also before the Second World War and after the Second World War. And actually throughout the 50s, there was no academic exchange with West Germany, but there was with France, for example, because these networks could not absolutely disappear in spite of the communist regime. So I even have a statistic, I don't have it now, that it shows that France and Italy were still receiving academic migration from Romania, even in the 50s, although it was very difficult. It was only a few of them, like 10 people a year or even less, but still there was. The fact is that like in Romania, there is this part, Transylvania, which have a very strong cultural input, German input, because the Saxons were there. And there people, for example, learn German, even in school, even nowadays, they learn directly in the German language. There are some special schools. Also, in the end of the 30s and throughout the Second World War, the collaboration between Romania and uniform. So also that was a factor. And what is interesting, and I didn't have the time to say, was that when the Humboldt Fellows were inviting these former fellows from the Second World War, these were very far-right oriented, or kind of they had a relationship with the far-right circles in interwar or Second World War Romania. And this kind of, these people further recommended other young people to receive the Humboldt Fellowship. So this kind of network from even prior to 53 kind of existed, and even after the 1990s, because the Humboldt Foundation is pretty conservative. And, you know, for example, they were financing a lot of young researchers in the field of philosophy, which kind of, you know, this kind of Hegelian philosophy or Heideggerian philosophy also. So German was important, but it was already there, I would say. And regarding the continuation of academic exchange, it was. So receiving a Humboldt Fellowship meant that you get into the system and you will remain there. You know, when receiving a Humboldt Fellowships, you are told that once Humboldtian, always Humboldtian. That was very valid. And actually that meant also a lot of money for the institution who sent these fellows, because Humboldt Foundation was also creating laboratories in Romania for these fellows. So that was also in the interest of the Ceausescu and the Romanian state. And this continued also after the revolution also. So throughout the communist regime, with periods of downs and ups, political fluctuations, and then after the revolution, very strong, I would say.
Yeah, for the question about languages, as I have said, there is a big difference between German-speaking part and French-speaking part in Switzerland, and you can really see that the students from French-speaking Africa go to French-speaking part of Switzerland and very less to Bern or to Zurich. And in the Polish case, it's the challenge for all the Eastern Bloc, the language, also for the USSR. And USSR have developed this idea of 1 year of language learning in one center, and in almost all countries from the Eastern Bloc, you can see this pattern with one center for language, and then the students who has to go to different universities in the country. It was the method that we found to learn a language, and we have to see through that the stay in Eastern Bloc was often very long. It could be 5 or 6 years with 1 year learning, language learning, and then the complete study in the country. So it was a very big experience. And for the question about what come after, it's very difficult because you have a lot of different destinies, different ways of life. What we can say, I think, is that in Switzerland, from the beginning, the authorities try to drive the students in the academic direction that could be useful in the countries, in the Swiss perspective. In Poland, the students got fellows to study in Poland, but without such already driving process for development. I should to study more in depth this question, but what I know, there are more, for example, students in the humanities in Poland than in Switzerland. Then there is some problems that have been already seen by historians. For example, Konstantin Katsakioris for students from USSR. It was the problem with then the competition of diplomas between those from the East and those from the West. And students from the East had sometimes some problems to win in the concurrence with those students who have studied in the West. But you have students also who have stayed in Poland after studies.
Yes, this was also a question, but I didn't want to ask more those who stayed as well in Poland, in Switzerland, but also in Germany. I mean, if it was also used as a, I mean, they were all, I mean, checked and double checked by different institutions, I understood, but I wondered who used it as a chance to not return.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Are there further questions? Or Irina, do you just want to respond?
Just to mention that many Humboldt fellows did not return to Romania, of course. So they used it as an opportunity to stay in the West.
Even though they have been vetted over and over again.
Absolutely, exactly. Even if they had families in Romania, they just did not return.
Maybe one more thing, if I may. It's important to see this students' mobility not from point A to the point B. Very often students had a lot of different destinations, and it's more complicated than from A to B and return. Very often the students, we can talk about from a capital of mobility. When you are mobile, you are ever more mobile.
Yes, I think history of migration is very interesting in context with like academic history or history of university of students, whatever you want to call it. Are there more questions for these two panelists? If not, thank you again very much for two great presentations and for a very interesting discussion. I have learned a lot. And I don't think we make a break now. We just continue in a last opportunity to talk to each other. I have not prepared like a big overview. I think at least I have learned a lot over the last 3 days or 2 days altogether. And I just want to give you the opportunity to respond. Yeah, Alexander. To raise questions or if some topics that want to be discussed. So the floor is open to everybody. It's like teaching the seminar when everyone just stares at you. Yes, Rudolf.
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, thank you for Stephanie and everybody else for this great event. It's really the question that I've been troubling with in writing up this paper of my own and listening to all your papers and presentations. And I think individually, I think we all can agree that the stories that we have presented in the last 3 days, they are all interesting and important in their own right. And I'm trying to get to the question that I always ask myself, so what, right? So Peter Misch, you know, my topic, great guy, interesting guy. Does his story relate to the larger historiographical debate that we are having? I suppose so, but I don't know what that is. And I think the question yesterday that Isabella asked me about, you know, what makes academics, what make historians, or what make the scholars that we have studied, what make them successful or not? If we don't want to attribute those to luck, what would that be, right? I mean, obviously, if I have the response to that, that would be great, but I don't think I have that. So I think I'm going to just to ask everybody, you know, here, you know, how do you think your story relate to the larger historiographical debate, either about, you know, wartime, or academia during wartime, or being an academic during turbulent political times? What would be your stance? So I'm just going to throw that out there.
Thank you. This is an excellent question for everybody, really, and especially to the one of us who work also with a biographical approach. You know, this question I always ask myself. Yes, Halvard.
Yes, thanks. Just maybe a quick add to that. Since the name of the conference is Academia in Times of Crisis, I find it interesting to link the question you posed to that specific notion of crisis. And I think it's interesting how the coincidence or the luck that we talked about yesterday, especially when we talked about scholars in accent, or more or less which left their home country. I think this connection to crisis is quite interesting. How are the crises in particular are defined in terms of, is it an academic crisis? Is it a crisis of people, of academia? Is it these aspects and facets of crisis in the larger discussion I find quite interesting, just to extend the question of the framework of the discussion.
Responses? or thoughts? So when we were thinking about this conference and how what should be the topic, right? I mean, in our project we work with in this time of the NS period, which is it's a political crisis, it's a crisis of society, of academia. It's a crisis in so many aspects, really. And we didn't want to just look at this short time frame, and we're thinking what could be a topic that really triggers ideas, questions, different perspectives. And we came up with that the crisis, to put crisis in the center, really allows us to study functioning of academia, ruptures, but as well continuities. So to look for factors that help us understand the functioning of academia. Because when we look at moments of crisis, we don't only see ruptures, we also can see continuities, and which helps us to put this in a bigger picture and include biographical examples as well as more structural perspective on the history of academia. And the history of academia, as Mathieu has said in his talk, has been, at least in Switzerland, a long time just looking at your own institution and looking at how grand it is and what it all achieved and what kind of big names it brought out. And I don't think, or we didn't think, that this is really adding a lot of knowledge or a lot of like interesting questions. I mean, this is this sort of quite boring, as we call it, angestaubt, a bit dusty. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Books which then end up in shelves and no one really looks at ever. And by breaking this up and looking at different factors, you can also try to add to the history of universities and academia in a more open and in a newer way. Someone raised a hand. Oh. Yes, Pushpa. You should turn on your microphone.
Thank you. I agree with everything that's been said about the sort of the themes of the conference and about widening the field of study about the history of academia. But I think one thing that struck me, having attended and listened to all the variety of talks, you know, from the biographical to the institutional to the more abstract, is that I suppose one thing, the so what question that was put is a very good one. And I think that one thing that maybe historical research on universities and academia is to keep sight of is the purpose of academia and the purpose of universities that sometimes gets forgotten in this sort of dusty histories you were talking about there, where the university is sort of set up as an ivory tower. It's not an ivory tower, as we've seen from all of these talks, that it's very much part of a political and economic and social culture and needs to be taken account of in that bigger sphere. So I suppose it's looking at academia as this sort of dynamic sphere that responds and shapes itself in response to very many different situations, those being huge crises like the world wars. But then on the other hand, it's not always about crisis, I suppose. It's about adapting to changing circumstances. So that's my little comment to add.
And maybe just thinking back to my initial words on the first day, that universities, the structures of universities have, despite everything, stayed or remained quite the same. I mean, the hierarchies, the granting of titles, so what a university is, even though it they definitely opened up. They're not these ivory towers anymore, as your talk has shown also, Pushpa, and as many talks have shown, but still it is an institution that has a long history, and despite all the crises, it has always adapted and sort of not revolutionized itself completely. And this I find quite interesting as well. I mean, it is more open to different social groups these days. But if we are looking at the discussions going on right now in Germany about the precarious status of academics who have not reached the professorship, who are being sort of kicked out of the system, these are still remains of this quite elitist institutions they used to be. So despite all the upheavals, despite the globalization also of the universities, there are still institutions with a quite far back reaching history and like a structure that have not completely been broken up, at least not in Europe. Yes, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, two things I wanted to say is the first, I think, is what we can see in all our presentation is that the crisis for academia had impact to globalize academia with exile, with other way for students to come to Europe or in other place to bring some scholars to stay in one country because they cannot return because there is war and so on. I think the crisis of the 20th century are a big globalization factor for the history of academia. And the other thing that I wanted to say, in a lot of papers, something is interesting and is something new in comparison with an old history of universities, is all the contacts with the world outside of the academia. We had a lot of, for example, scholars in exiles that have opened a museum in South America, or we have some scholars who are teachers in the university for adults. We have, in my case, so for example, all this problem of housing has an impact of a lot of people outside of academia, and this relation between academia and the world, for me, was very interesting in this conference, and I think we should go also in this direction.
Please, Irina.
Yeah, I also want to say something. So regarding this history of the universities, I think they should be completely rewritten, at least for me as a historian working with the history of universities and academia and so on. Actually, these official histories of universities, which most of the time were festivist, like 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, they do not so much help me in my research. They kind of, I do my research in spite of this official festivist histories. So they don't take into, they have this tendency of not taking into account at all the social history, or even these crisis moments, these delicate moments, or for example, I don't know, looking also at like hidden figures of, I was thinking about, like, for example, when you enter the University of Bucharest, you see on the big hall these portraits of all directors of the university, all male, most of them also with political functions in various regimes. You know, you can do a history of the state by watching, and the history of the politics by watching these portraits, but not the history of the actual university and of the academic environment and the educational. So I think it should be rewritten. Yeah.
And I guess to a certain extent, that's what we are doing. But I don't think anyone would now write the history of the University of Bucharest or the history of the University of Basel, but looking at questions, at smaller questions, and breaking these narratives up. But Marino.
Yes, thank you. Well, I just wanted to say, and it's not a statement that I have fully formulated now, so, but what Mathieu said and what some of the others mentioned, this relationship of the university to the world, or academia to the world outside, is what I find very important as well. And it really seems to bring into question the second word of the conference title, the autonomy. So the university conceives of itself as an autonomous organization at sometimes, but it has to. This is constantly in question when it is in relations with outside institutions, and so maybe we or I start to think about this academia not only as a sphere that adapts to crisis and develops continuous forms of reacting to crisis, but also a sphere that is in constant or permanent crisis itself, because it has to redefine and reform itself all the time in its relations to very different spheres. So, but this is just a preliminary thought, then I will have to think about this more. But this conference really helped, so thank you.
Thank you for this. I now have, I think, first Sinja and then Irina again.
Yeah, I wanted to add and try to answer a little bit also Rudolf's question from the beginning, because we discussed about it yesterday already, Rudolf and me. What is the relevance of all these selected people and this case studies? I found it interesting that in relation to this exchange between university world and the other world, that these case studies made it possible to have a comparison between completely different subjects of study, and that I have had have some ideas for my projects, which works with organizations, but come now from people that work with biographies, and that it makes that this studies on people make it possible to focus on different aspects of this exchange that would not appear if you study just university history as a whole, or a whole university. I don't know if it was clear, but it's just an idea.
Thank you. I think I had Irina and then Linda. Is this correct?
Actually, in my case, I forgot to lower the...
So, Linda, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to share one upcoming aim of my research, a very small aim, but I would actually love to try to work on people who couldn't adapt, for example, after a crisis. It's obvious there's so many of them, and I think it's actually, I did for myself, it's very easy to work about such a successful archaeologist, and it's a great story to tell, and you know, I have success because of talking about this great success, but actually she was one from 100 people going to Chile or even more. Without, they couldn't have these possibilities, and it's hard to find the sources about them, but to be fair, we should also try to have a look who couldn't adapt or who didn't want to adapt. accept the circumstances and left academia. Sometimes it's not being a victim, it's also sometimes taking agency, saying, with these circumstances, I don't want to be part anymore of university or academia in a broader space. So yeah, maybe talking about the unsuccessful or changed life paths would be interesting for me as well. Yeah, just a thought.
Thank you. This is such an important point. Also because I think universities always look at those who leave them by free will, because they decide to go another path, because they don't want to do this kind of rat race, if you want to call it, as a failure. But then there's always, as you said, the problem of sources. It is so much easier to track down people who were successful in some way or other, however you want to define this, than those who left by free will or not. But then Stephanie, Salvisberg.
I just wanted to add, and I also saw that it's difficult to find a lot of sources about this subject, but all the people who worked at university, but not as professors or lecturers, and were not there as students, but like the technical support and the secretaries and all the, for example, medical assistances, because what I saw, there were some really interesting cases, and there were also a lot of women. So it would be really interesting to consider these stories also more in like writing the history of universities. So that was all.
Yes, thank you. Also very important. And maybe also linking back to Rudolf's question, the so what, which is really so important. Looking at all these individual histories and studies and also aid organizations, all these case studies really allows this very broad, multi-perspective view on the history of university and not just this institutional history. So I think working with a micro view on history really helps breaking up sort of narratives which seem to have, turned into stone and haven't been questions for a long time, and looking at different stories makes us question bigger narratives and look in more depth. So I think there is a reason to do these individual stories we all presented, or you all presented. I didn't present mine over the course of the last 3 days. Do we have more reactions or questions? If not, it remains me to thank everybody for your presentations, for your questions, participation in the discussions, my team, and especially Alexandra, for helping to organize this event, the Swiss National Foundation for financing our project and a small part of this conference. And I'm very much looking forward to be in contact with all of you again about the upcoming publication, and I hopefully also in other forms and formats, having a cup of coffee somewhere, not virtual. And maybe we can look at this upcoming volume as a contribution to another way of writing university history, like in the broader sense. So you will hear from us in a couple of days after we all had a break. And we all wish you a good summer. And I'm looking forward to reading all the articles soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.